A pensioner, 6 years a slave for the financial benefit of the National Trust. This is all about when I managed an estate that was left to the National Trust. Hello, I am a pensioner now in my 80s. I am not used to doing things like this. So please bear with me and I will tell you, along with my wife, we have been treated as slave labour by the National Trust, to whom we gave hundreds of diligent, conscientious hours in over 6 years of physical and mental effort. My correspondence on this to the chairman of the National Trust, René Olivier, has never received a reply. What I will tell you here has been described as a travesty of justice. So here is the truth and nothing but the truth. First, you need to understand that in the UK, I am the only surviving relative of my family who are all down under in Australia. And firstly, let me say that I am fully aware that I did not have any pre-agreement with the National Trust. But even so, how does the National Trust think that the estate and the real estate survived? I am talking about here for them to benefit from to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Forgive me, I am reading from my script. It was not by some miracle that it survived. It only survived as a result of my attention with my wife for over 6 years. There is nobody else, I repeat, nobody else in the UK who could have done this. Without my wife and me, it would have fallen to professional practices at a mega cost to the estate, or it would have become derelict. I do feel that this is to some degree an abuse of power by the National Trust, who are using expensive lawyers. The likes of me and my wife are just walked over as a result and cast aside. They just want to sweep us under the carpet. The National Trust is a multi-million pound UK-wide public trading organisation, and the treatment I have been subjected to is extremely unfair, to say the very least. The National Trust is, as I have said, using expensive lawyers against me, with the aim of depriving me of any due consideration for the hard-earned hours of physical and mental effort put in for their financial benefit. As a pensioner, I don't have an expensive lawyer to fight my corner. The story centres all on a few years ago. I did at that time have one other relative living in London SW20, which is close to the centre of Wimbledon. In case you are not aware, that's part of London. He had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I received a phone call from his brother, in Adelaide, Australia, asking me if I would be capable to cope with managing the estate and the real estate of his brother in London SW20. You must bear in mind that I was already 76 years old and living in my home in Southampton, which is some 70 miles away, 140 miles return. And when this finished some 6 years later, I was into my 80s. With all this in mind, my cousin in Australia was concerned that it might have been too much for me. Now, in most families at times like this, sharing responsibilities by abilities comes into play. And it was all a bit daunting, I must admit, particularly with the distance. Anyway, I diligently pressed ahead, doing whatever arose. I committed in my head that I would do it, maintaining constant communication with the family in Australia. My wife happens to be a lot younger than me, and she undertook to do most of the driving. Each journey 140 miles return, which we would embark on 2 or 3 times a month, depending on the need. When I was first able to gain legal entry to my cousin's real estate, with the help of a locksmith, I found the house in complete shambles. It had been made worse by the fact that it had had a serious fire in it when my cousin gutted the kitchen just before he entered the nursing home. This meant there was a lot of smoke and water damage. One of the first things I found that I least expected, in a heap of rubbish piled on the dining room table, were the deeds to the property and, to my amazement, the copy of the will. The will told me from the outset that the estate in total would eventually form the legacy for the National Trust to receive. So I was fully aware, right from the beginning, that all of my efforts would be for the financial benefit of the National Trust. It made no difference to me, and with this in my head, I still began diligently to work on the challenges that lie ahead. With only my wife's support, I dedicated myself for over the next 6 years, mentally and physically, to improve and safeguard the value of the estate and the property. And it did prove very daunting. Throughout the years, the work entailed, on a daily basis, dealing with banks, solicitors, insurance companies, assurance companies, pension providers, borough council officials, social services representatives, medical professionals, that is the doctors and consultants, garden contractors, house clearance contractors, antique dealers, painters and decorators, cleaning contractors, estate agents, and at the same time shipping consignments to Australia. With my wife, we put in hundreds of hours of work over the 6+ years, adding value to the estate all the time. This is what made it possible, in the end, for the National Trust to receive a legacy of hundreds of thousands of pounds. The estate and the real estate did not do this by itself. When you take over responsibility for someone's life, as I did here, it comes with everything from the finances to the kitchen sink, and all that arrives through the letterbox and drops on the carpet, which has to be dealt with correspondence and phone calls, and so it was for over 6 years. Over this time, I kept the real estate secure, with a lived-in appearance, preventing vandalism, preventing squatters, and preventing, above all, dereliction. With my wife, we put in hundreds of hours, each and every hour, working for the financial benefit of the National Trust. I would have been perfectly within my rights to have called in the professionals and just signed the fact checks that would have resulted had I done so, but this would have been to the detriment of the estate and the resulting loss of value to the National Trust to receive. I didn't because of the cost. Instead, I saved mega sums of money for the National Trust to benefit by. For over 2 years, I have been in communication with the National Trust solicitors, trying to get some compensation for all the hours my wife and me worked that achieved so much for the National Trust. In December 2021, I received a letter from the lawyers of the National Trust telling me that the National Trust would like to transfer money to my bank account in compensation. But then they continued to say in the letter that the Charity Commission's regulations prevented them from doing so. A case of now you see it, now you don't. I have read the Charity Commission's regulations, and the regulations make ample provision for contingencies like that of myself. And besides, the National Trust is paying hundreds of contractors all the time, every year. And my services are no different. If the National Trust had any honourable intentions, it would have found a route round the problem. There are no conditions attached to paying the contractors, and why should I be classed as anything any different? The National Trust is acting in bad faith. We supplied the National Trust with a highly detailed account, together with a spreadsheet that covered each of the 6 years, and showing my activity of weekly covering 40 areas of responsibility that I had undertaken. This is why people describe my situation as a travesty of justice. Throughout the 6 years, I only received basic expenses. When you are custodian of an estate for such a long period of time as I was, and in the end, a multi-million pound UK-wide trading conglomerate as the National Trust then tries to wriggle out of any responsibility for all the work done on their behalf, and by a man who is a pensioner, then it is truly a travesty of justice. It is truly shameful conduct by the National Trust, who see my wife and myself as expendable slave labour to be cast aside and swept under the carpet. This is not what one expects from a reputable household name. It is outrageous, churlish, shameful conduct and an abuse of power. It is the principle. A public multi-million pound UK-wide trading organisation picks up the bounty but gives no thought to how it was made possible for them, with some financial consideration in the end.